Hans Utter, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for part 6 of our series on music, mind control, and psychobiology. And it looks like we're going to probably need to do at least one more part after this. Is that correct?
It probably appears so. I always try to just keep things narrow, but then there's so much context involved. And so I ended up finding all these other interconnections, and just like this, you know, certain things aren't going to make sense without sort of a background. So yeah, it just keeps on going. So, and as I said, you know, any one of these topics could just be expanded outwards ad infinitum. But
well, you know, the feedback from this series has been extremely positive. There has been quite a bit of feedback on my end. I'm sure you've gotten some feedback as well.
I have, and actually, I was thinking about this as doing something. It wouldn't really necessarily be an episode, but just answering some of the questions or queries I've gotten, because there's a lot of interesting points people are making, and even I'm getting people are, you know, sending some different kinds of information. I'd certainly like to kind of bring that out, but obviously within this context, we can't really answer specific questions. But I'll try to touch on a few of those as they come to mind tonight.
All right, so where do we want to begin? I know, you know, we've got a lot of material to cover here, so how about we start with Hendrix?
Yeah, well, I've got a quote from Hendrix, which in a certain way typifies what we'll be looking at today, and this is, quote, "Music is a spiritual thing of its own. You hypnotize people to where they go right back to their natural state, which is pure positive. And when you get people at their weakest point, you can preach into the subconscious what we want to say." And that's from Life magazine. It's interesting, actually. Life magazine got a lot of candid interviews from a number of artists and other types of people. But so in that way, this idea of sort of hypnotizing people with music, to a certain extent, as we're going to look at, but also how the mind is defined and how all these things are interconnected. But primarily, we do have to look at the undergirding systematic substructures and thought systems that have led to particular ventures in this arena.
All right, so let's review the 8 factors of musical manipulation.
Okay, so yeah, as I went through in the first lecture, in which hopefully my book, I'm about halfway through, we'll get that out and people can review that and see these different elements that are not, I think they're logically apparent. Right. At the same time, these 8 factors, I did get some critiques here and there that there's no references. Well, all that stuff is referenced in a vast amount of literature. And primarily, when you look at music itself, you see that these positive sort of negative polarities are available for any of these levels. So today, when we're going to be looking at the nonlinear dynamic systems model, is a way to sort of step outside most of these paradigms and see how they interconnect and interrelate. There are some kind of troubling or perhaps speculative research into what could be described as, you know, quantum consciousness. Maybe I shouldn't use the word quantum, but the idea of trying to get into this space of consciousness. However, these factors, we're going to see the way the human mind is modeled and understood really serves as a backbone for not only just a greater understanding of the contemporary society we live in, but also for clarifying how not all of these models work at all times. And all these things are interconnected. And by nonlinear, we'll look at some things a bit later about creating sort of cybernetic loops, closed system, psychological sort of traps. And I think that's kind of a big point of how music and manipulation works. So just like to have, I'm not going to go through all the points right now in the interest of brevity, but just like to have everyone maybe go back and look those over, and I will put out even maybe a brief little outline. So just to keep in mind that when we look at, say, for example, we look at influencing behavior control or crowd dynamics, social dynamics, that's one aspect. Even within that dynamics, first of all, you have to have a model of what the crowd is. Second of all, you have to have a model of what dynamics are. That is, what are you working with? What is the breakdown of the energetic systems within that? But primarily, as my intention in these interviews is to give people a way to sort of step outside and see the big picture and see these different models. Because important thing to keep in mind is, look, these people are fallible. I'm fallible in my English there, but these people are fallible. They're not perfect. They're also tend to be very grandiose. And the fact is that if all this stuff worked exactly as it was intended, we would be a lot worse off. And so the amount of time, energy, capital, research, human lives that have gone into this is just immense. And the fact is that they're still are, rolling out different things every day. You can see a new type of, discussion, debate, and things like that, coming out in terms of Obama's new thing or Cass Sunstein or whatever. This stuff is still ongoing, but the fact is that, generally speaking, there's a lot of core ideas that keep being referred to. So once you understand the core values and the core systemic structures, then you really have a much better grasp on working your way through this mass of material and also, life experience, et cetera.
Yeah, it definitely requires a lot of life experience. I mean, when you're in your 20s, your teens, and you're hearing all of this stuff about music, all you want to do is just laugh it off. Oh, that's ridiculous. And then you get older and you can step back and see it. But hopefully we've provided enough information in this series with 6 video parts plus 5 radio updates up to now, with the 7th one coming. So, that's like 20 hours of material. So hopefully we've made it possible for anyone to understand and grasp and at how this is all affecting them. All right. So anyway, what do you want to go into next year?
Well, we'll just kind of go straight down outline. So I can just say that this is a little bit a response to, I've had some questions. People are very concerned about listening to music. They're concerned either as, is all music bad, or is this something that's happening? Or also questions about evil, quote unquote Satanism, Luciferianism. What does that mean? Am I positing this sort of, Manichean dualistic model of good and evil? And hell yes, I am. No. Actually, the idea is,
regardless if you're doing that, these people are using these dualistic forms. It's, and I mean, there is truth and there is lies and there is yin and there is yang. So, I mean, there is this dualism in nature. There is day and night, etc. So, if people want to call it what they will, it's still there. It's still being used.
No, it certainly is. And, the idea of evil, right? There's an idea of evil, which we'll kind of get into a little bit, is this idea that we call it quote unquote Luciferian or satanic, is really based on a supercharged idea of ultimate human agency, and in fact, individual agency, and in fact, a very narrow segment of the society that's that is actually considered to be man, or you say humankind, a person. Let's use gender neutral words. It's going to be gender neutral day today. So, but
playing right into that agenda there.
Yeah, no. But when you look at this idea of occult, and well, my next point is the occult and the technotronic control grid. A lot of these ideas arose at the same time, and it's very important to see that a lot of these people were working hand in hand. They were not necessarily separate, totally separate ideologies or viewpoints. And so you can kind of break this down into both sides, and it really comes down to the same thing or same things, but there are, of course, many different viewpoints, and it's certainly not a monolithic entity. So, again, sharing similar objectives and differing and occasionally unified and sometimes cross-populating their agenda or goals. What we ascertain is that a lot of these are distortions, right, of natural processes. So, for example, the idea that life energy, William Blake talks about that, the poet, it's famous for, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see nature as it is infinite, right? This English artist and poet who, talked about Satan or evil being this active energy principle, and then God being sort of this null principle of, non or inaction. The problem is that you get these manipulations, so where people, they begin to embrace negativity, begin to embrace evil, begin to take on a smaller scale what is being done on a much more powerful scale by the elite. So we can see this from the crack dealer who is mirroring the capitalist with his idea of, I'll kill anybody I want to make my money. It's just about me, etc. And you see it, the guy with the beater car that's breaking down with the, George Bush bumper stickers. And you see this across the board of sort of wending this elite agenda, whether it's sort of, you could describe as satanic practices or describe as this kind of uber selfishness, destruction of community. This agenda gets presented to the masses as a valid mode of being, which sort of erases our innate sort of moral code, our innate sense of what's right and wrong, and that's kind of makes us into psychopath juniors, So I think that's kind of the main point when I describe what is evil or satanic, is really the reversal and the usurping of our natural function as being connected to a society.
And not only that, but this stuff is laid out in essentially the Bible. Whether or not you believe the Bible is irrelevant, and clearly these people are taking that and flipping it upside down and using it to deconstruct society. You don't have to believe in Christianity necessarily or anything else to see that going on there, to see all of the satanic references. And that's a lot of what the Kabbalah is. That's not the whole Kabbalah, but a lot of the Kabbalah, there is a dark side of the Kabbalah, and it does take stuff and flip it upside down for manipulative purposes. And, so that stuff is there. Obviously the Kabbalah came out of the Jewish religion, as well as the Torah, the Old Testament. So it's there. Do you want to look at it or do you want to ignore it, essentially?
Yeah. Well, the whole idea is really, if you look at genetically modified food, and if you look at the idea of doing a black magic ritual, say you're hanging out with Aleister Crowley while he's bedding down your wife and making you watch, and then, feeding you a dead cat or something. And whether you're doing that or whether you're buying a Monsanto product or supporting fracking, it comes down almost to the same thing. The idea is this total control over nature, but also the destruction and this rejection.
And the ownership of life itself, because GMO products, they're all going to have a patent on them, and then they're going to be owned by somebody. It's no longer nature coming from seed. I mean, how much more in your face can it get that this is anti-life, anti-freedom, and everything else?
Oh, exactly. And that's a fundamental thing to understand. And just as another aside, people ask, like, what music should I listen to? How should I approach this? And one thing, I think that it's good to take sort of as a musician, I'm saying this, but maybe take a little bit of a cultural fast, and then sort of fast mean sort of avoid some stuff for a while and kind of rebuild your sense of what music is in a certain way with your community by listening maybe to more challenging forms of music, by undertaking some form of study. And say for me right now, you'll get an intuitive sense. You can hear certain music and you'll feel it. You can actually feel it resonating in your body. And it's not even really a question of, having to analyze stuff. You can, something has a harmful effect. Naturally, we're going to be aware of that. And the whole thing is training us to avoid what is naturally good, training us to avoid good foods, training us to avoid positive, constructive relationships.
Yeah, well, family, good thing. Oh, we need to have as much wild sex partying as we can so that we can grow old and rely on the government.
Yeah, exactly. And then it comes down to the fact that which we'll look at these feedback loops and look at Bateson and these other people, and you see that you start to see how these psychological techniques are deployed. And some work, some don't work, some work on certain, agendas. These are not, all these psychological techniques doesn't necessarily mean, or psychological systems are not perfect, but they work and they can work, especially if you're not aware of them. And especially if you've lost your own innate connection, your own sense of reasoning and your own intuition. How many times do you walk in somewhere and say, man, this is not a good place, or these people are not good people, but I'm going to go hang out with them anyways? How many times do we still our own sense of what's bad? That doesn't mean you have to become paranoid and things like that. On the other hand, you should be aware of that and have your full sense of reasoning, as well as being able to control your emotions. And that goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier about Plato saying music gives a way to deal with emotional responses and not be taken over by them, not be limited to this impulsive stimulus response behavior, and not viewing adolescent drug addicted rock stars as some kind of model for human development, which is kind of how I grew up, probably how you grew up, right? Who are you going to model? You're going to model Ronald Reagan, or you're going to look at Jim Morrison or Robert Plant or whoever and say, these guys are free. These guys are doing what needs to be done, and I should be like them. And that's a big part of how this works. Not that you should idolize Ronald Reagan. I'm not saying that, but does that make sense?
And the irony of bringing up Ronald Reagan there, of course, he was president, and then he was governor of California, and he was an actor. But before all of that, he did radio voiceovers for radio shows like Orson Welles type stuff.
Yeah. And that's...
So, and it's like, if you think about all of that and you think about the intel world doing all of these studies and manipulating and controlling radio and television and everything else, and it's like, well, of course Reagan became governor and then president, as well as Schwarzenegger. Of course actors are going to come up through there.
Yeah, and this is something maybe we'll get into in another time, but I started looking at all these events, and I started doing numerological research on all these events. And I found some stuff that it kind of freaked me out, actually, in terms of just some of the things. Okay, not everything is like that. And certainly, again, you don't want to make this global perspective, but there's certain events that are connected and mirrored. And you start to say, wait, this took place on this anniversary, exactly this many days, exactly this many months and hours. An example being the Beatles coming after Kennedy's assassination. Exactly 77 days, 11 weeks. And you can start to see. Now, this certainly can be viewed as speculation, and very well might be. However, there is certain parallel patterns in terms of looking at larger scale events, because we're taught to narrow our focus. We're taught to narrow our perceptions to such a limited band of awareness. Okay, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? What kind of new car am I going to get? Who am I going to go home with? Or we really have been sort of reduced to this almost instantaneous binary sort of gratification state. At the same time, we're more and more than ever separated from our actual present moment experience in terms of what we actually are hearing, seeing around us. So, and in fact, today we're kind of look at how that happens. How do we get taken away, or how are these things implemented?
All right. So which point are we on here?
Okay, we're on actually point I. So I just wanted to give a quote from Michael Aquino. And, as I was saying, the occult and sort of technotronic control grid, or described as the, however you wanted to put that into terms, are bedfellows that really from day one. And I think a great personification of that is Mr. General, now General Michael Aquino. I'm sure everyone's familiar with him. Temple of Set and all kinds of other, rumors, and also all kinds of stuff. So Michael Aquino, hopefully everyone is familiar with him, and he's
well.
again,
And we did show him, I think, in the last video, or we've definitely shown him in this series. But I'll throw up his image here as well.
But there's a quote from Michael Aquino. So, through the media possessed by the United States, which have the capabilities to reach virtually all people on the face of the earth. These media are, of course, the electronic media, television and radio, state-of-the-art developments in satellite communication, video recording techniques, and laser and optical transmission of broadcasts make possible a penetration of the minds of the world such as would have been inconceivable just a few years ago. Like the sword of Excalibur, we have but to reach out and seize this tool, and it can transform the world for us if we have the courage and integrity to enhance civilization with it. If we do not accept Excalibur, then we relinquish our abilities to inspire foreign cultures with our morality. If they then desire moralities unsatisfactory to us, we have no choice but to fight them on a more brutish level. So that's a mind war from his document. And that's interesting quote, because notice the reference to Excalibur, right? Notice this reference to the Arthurian mythos, right? This idea of the sword of Excalibur, but also what we see across the board is this framing it as this positive endeavor. At the same time, describing this inconceivable tool to penetrate the minds of the world, as well as, of course, the minds of our own culture, which has been proven again and again. So that's just an example, a little bit of the bleed over between occult belief systems, which again, General Michael Aquino is a major practicing occultist, founder of a temple of Set, as well as a psi warfare, electronics warfare operant specialist, and connected with all kinds of things like pedophile rings, etc. So a pretty nasty guy with some pretty weird eyebrows. But I mean, yeah, I wonder.
I think he intentionally turns them into little devils, Satan's horns.
But so I'll just continue on that. And if you look at Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, right, and he's someone. He wrote this, declaration sort of the rights of man, which is a very important Renaissance, 15th century Renaissance document. But when I was looking into some of this stuff, looking into my do with thou wilt stuff, I started coming across his direct connections. He's seen as this great humanist, this great humanitarian, but his quote from him, from his biography, quote, "Divine providence caused certain books to fall into my hands. They are Chaldean books, Eversidas, of Zoroaster, and of Melchior, oracles of the Magi, which contain a brief and dry interpretation of Chaldean philosophy, but full of mystery." So this guy is presented as a big humanist, a big, part of the scientific revolution, etc. But he was a major occultist. And in fact, I didn't really get into all the details, but he talked about the Chaldeans just a little bit, but these mystery schools, there's a direct reference point back to that. And all these things can be traced back, both the scientific revolution and these occult doctrines and dogma. And in fact, they're not seen as separate. If you look at the alchemical laboratories, if you look at the development of modern chemistry out of alchemy, you see that these things were not seen as separate. And I think a big part of the power of the, so to speak, control grid too, is to remove certain possible vectors of awareness from our minds. So we think, oh, this is all just mumbo jumbo. This doesn't mean anything. And some of it may well be total mumbo jumbo. On the other hand, a lot of this stuff has been used and utilized and continues to be used in very much a merged sense. So there's a hidden doctrine for the elect, and science and magic are looked at as kind of outgrowths, and these occultic energies and manipulations are seen, science is really seen as an outgrowth. Again, going back to genetically modified food, that's a direct outgrowth of the dogma stated by Pico when he talks about man ascending becoming greater than God, man being able to create life himself. So this is I think this ideal, which is certainly there, and what I would describe as the marriage of science and occultism. Finishing up, I wanted to read a quote from Henry Murray. Henry Murray is a psychologist, and he was lecturing the American Psychological Association. And he said, quote, "And here is where our psychology comes in with the bulk of its theories and images of man, obviously in league with the satanic spirit. Man is a computer, an animal, an infant. His destiny is completely determined by genes, instincts, accidents, early conditionings and reinforcements, cultural and social forces. Love is a secondary drive based on hunger and oral sensation or reaction formation to underlying hate. There are no provisions for creativity, no admitted margins of freedom, no fitting recognitions of the power of ideas, not ground at all for any hope that the human race can save itself from the fatality that now confronts it." And this is from a prominent psychologist giving the keynote lecture in 1964.
Well, and Henry A. Murray was actually part of the MK Ultra program at Harvard. And, of course, he was CIA, but he was at Harvard, and Timothy Leary was under him, and he worked with guys like B.F. Skinner and Dr. Robert Hyde, and also there's a possible relationship there to Gordon Wasson, but he also heavily influenced Dick Price, who was actually in his department, and then Dick Price went on to found the Esalen Institute. So that's who Henry Murray is.
Yeah, and so if you look at it, and what I find to be very interesting, a lot of times you see these critiques, right, presented in a certain way, or you see inversions of morality. So we look at the Michael Aquino document talking about our duty to save the world and promote our positive morality through the Excalibur sword of infinite power that we can use to slice through people's minds. And then Henry Murray is saying images of man, obviously in league with the satanic spirit. And it's saying this is where our psychology comes in with the bulk of its theories. So right there, he's making that statement, which, to be honest, I wasn't familiar with his other connections. I just, I was, doing some research and I saw that quote. I thought it was a great quote, and I took it to be a critical quote. And now you're saying he's with MK Ultra. So,
well, yeah, I mean, not only that, but Timothy Leary worked in his department. He's one of the big guys that they've actually thrown under the bus in regard to MK Ultra,
Yeah. And so again, could there be a more direct statement of this entire system than that? I don't think so. I mean, it's pretty much reducing us to these forms, reducing us to a computer, reducing us to infants with no possibility for freedom. And that's exactly, you could, kind of what we're going towards, and hopefully we can reverse that trend. So we're
I
basically...
agree. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just briefly to kind of go over what we're going to talk about, we're going to just look at some of these basic psychological paradigms, just to give people a sense of how some of the things have been used, manipulated, etc., as well as just to give a sense of how the mind has been modeled. And then we're going to go into, I'm going to take all this theory and apply it concretely to specific analysis of two pieces of music. So this will be all grounded in empirical, interpretive reality. So we'll just kind of dive in, and I'll kind of touch on these points, not going into tremendous depth, but hopefully give people the interest in sort of following up on some of this stuff as well.
All right, so grounding basic psychological paradigms.
Okay, so when we look at psychology, we have to understand that it's not a new field, right? Psychology did not just begin in the 19th century or the 18th century. Psychology has been around for as long as there have been human beings. It just was embedded in different ways. And sometimes you're going to find a much deeper psychological understanding, or a much more clear and compelling, what we call quote unquote psychological understanding, in even going back to ancient Greece, going into various artists and philosophers, especially religion, because religion was really primarily, if you look at it, it's primarily a psychological system, ideas of development and things like that. So, ritual, a lot of times psychological understanding was embedded in ritual art, et cetera. But we do see a shift in the Enlightenment era. And in the Enlightenment era, we have this idea that man is like a mechanical clock. And if you've ever seen some of these amazing mechanical inventions, they have like entire, incredibly complex, moving scenes and these clocks. So they really got into this idea of mechanization and setting all this stuff going. And so the idea of the clockwork man, the idea that man can be programmed and controlled is sort of a fun. Go ahead.
I was just going to add Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, that's right in your face there.
Exactly. And most people are not, partially because the education system has been nullified to the point where people don't have any basic ground in how this civilization developed. Because if you read Shakespeare and listen to how most people talk today, half of those words are gone out of use. And those people that are educated, that speak to each other through their academic journals or other types of dialogue, have basically shut out a vast portion of the population that no longer has grown up with not only.
Well, and that was the intent of guys like I.A. Richards, who developed the 850-word English language, and he was right smack in the middle of all these guys,
Yeah, and so just continuing with that, we look at Freud, Sigmund Freud, who became such a seminal figure in psychoanalysis, development of modern psychology. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Freud's impact, but to what extent are people familiar with how Freud changed how we view the mind, right? So, for example, in Persian and Arabic and Hindi, the idea of mind is actually mind and heart, right? This idea that our emotions and our mental processes are interlocking or interlinked phenomena. And with Freud, we had this idea of the ego. So when we define an ego, he's a big ego. He's an egomaniac. Well, when we even use that word, we're really using a Freudian definition of the self, which, just like the removal of certain linguistic forms or their prevalence in different cultures, indicates a lack of perception of those modes of reality. In the same way, in an analogous way, Freud's conditioning our response of the ego, the superid, the Oedipus complex, all these things, makes us see our minds sort of with this teeming, seething unconscious of all these, very animalistic drives. We all want to go out and be like Oedipus and things like that, which not only based on a lot of fraudulent research, but also really narrows and limits how we view what ourselves are, how we experience ourselves. And even the idea of a big ego just being a term, these sort of blinders wend their way into our discourse, and we really kind of have to break free and understand where these things came from in order to remove a lot of these culturally embedded paradigms.
Indeed. All right. So Mesmer, Lacan, Bateson, and I've covered Bateson a lot. I've covered Mesmer some.
Okay. Yeah. Well, these guys are, if we look at, so I started out with the kind of the mechanistic model. I moved into the Freud sort of limited power model of the mind with these kind of battling different potentialities that may be unknown to each other and these sort of unconscious drives, primarily sexual. We can look at Mesmer, Lacan, and Bateson. We have a kind of a much more nuanced approach. To a certain extent, I mean, Mesmer, again, sort of dealing with mesmerism, idea of hypnosis. We talked about that briefly, but this is idea, again, of going into someone's subconscious mind and being able to manipulate those contents or being able to influence their behavior. And also the opening up to the exploration of this entire inner realm and sort of mapping this inner space, or at least understanding how to manipulate that. Lacan, who we'll talk about in a lot more detail, is very important. He's a a sort of a critic of Freud who's coming out of a Freudian paradigm, but expanded and sort of critiqued some of Freud's theories, and some of his models were certainly cited quite a bit in the Princeton Radio Project, and I will argue have been extremely important, especially in music. And then Bateson, we'll look at Bateson as well, and Bateson is another person, again, with a model that's much more nuanced. But then we take Mesmer and Lacan, and then we suddenly put these into a model of an energetic system that can be manipulated and sort of set on its own course. So we create these semi-autonomous, even cultural or individual operating psychological systems. And we'll even look at Bateson in more detail when we look at the Beatles. So that's just kind of a second or third stage of the development of psychology.
And Kurt Lewin, he's another good one, and I think I've covered Lewin in some of my work. But let's see, Kurt Lewin, he was one of the founders of the Macy conferences and Project MKUltra. He worked for the Tavistock Institute. He was a big-time Zionist. He was also a eugenicist, of course, also worked with B.F. Skinner, who we just mentioned, worked with Norbert Wiener, was at MIT, etc.
Yeah, and Kurt Lewin is important sort of in this idea of psychobiology. And this also connects with bioenergetics, which I may get into a bit later. But Kurt Lewin, in one sense, went beyond the work of these other people because he looked at this, went from the idea of modeling the life world, using important book he has, Principles of Topological Psychology. So this is an idea of looking at not only outer space in terms of our relational space, societally constructed structures, but also different types of inner world, inner drives, developmental model, but really looking at mapping and modeling both inner and outer spaces. Again, using a very detailed topological model, and also looking at external conditions, how these are influenced, how our perceptions of external conditions are manipulated by changing the inner sort of life world spaces as well as changing the outer life world spaces. And in terms of his modeling and spatial deployment of understanding different zones and sectors and really approaching this inner space as a plane, as the and including multiplicity. So we do have a little more complexity than, say, Freud. Llewellyn also, did work on a very pragmatic and sort of scientific agenda as well. And I won't get into critiques of him, but needless to say, he has another very fun document, Mental Health and World Citizenship, a statement to the International Conference on Psychological Health, written in 1948, where he describes remodeling societies on the principles of mental health, working on individuals, social groups, dismantling tradition, working on ideologies, working on setting up this entire very detailed infrastructure on multiple planes to increase mental health. And his important thing that he emphasized was the plasticity of individual societies. So in this way, he was kind of way ahead of his time, because a lot of these people, even someone like Chomsky, in terms of his generative grammar, looks at the brain as sort of like hardwired like a computer. Llewellyn looks at these things as plasticity, meaning that with neuroplasticity, things can be changed, even things that seem to be set in stone. Like look at marriage, look at gender. This stuff, you can just turn on your TV, open up your newspaper and see that even basic categories like gender, you have to use, one of the funniest things I saw recently was some faculty member came up with a list of gender neutral pronouns to use. So you have to call like or him or something, and it just absolutely ridiculous. You're not supposed to say his or her because you're going to offend someone. But I mean, dude, gender is pretty much biological. Now, in India, you have an entire caste of transvestites known as hijras. They have their own political system. I've been chased by a crowd of hijras. They sing songs. You have to give them money, and they can be very aggressive. I mean, they're almost like they have their own mafia. But in India, it's just sort of a naturally accepted part of life. And you have these groups. And one of them became a senator. And India is much more "quote unquote" conservative than America, but it's not looked on as you have to distort natural systematic structures or functions for the point of anomalous things, which are part of any system, which have their own place. And I have nothing against.
Well, yeah, and we both know the agenda behind all this gender neutral nonsense being peddled.
Yeah, but anyways, with Llewellyn, we have this idea again of for the good, for the greater good, we're going to remodel, restructure society. And so this document, which I'll send you a copy of, Mental Health and World Citizenship, Destruction of Nationality, Destruction of Tradition, and Allowing Us to Become World Citizens, 1948. And so this stuff is going to this day.
All right, basic development and ancient Greece. Excuse me.
Okay, so now we're going a little more detail, a little more close focus, a little soft lighting. I should have a disco ball in here. I love.
Perfect.
When I got this house, it was owned by, kind of a long story. I think there was actually owned by some guys running a huge cartel, and they had all this chain of Mexican stores, but all these rooms were filled with mirrors, like floor to ceiling. So this whole room, my whole studio was just, if anyone wants any mirrors, I got a garage full of mirrors. But anyways, just throwing that out there. But anyways, but so in ancient Greece, we have just some basic concepts. And I'm just going to give a little brushstroke here. So one of the basic things we look at it, or we think of Greece, you look at Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy, is he talks about the contrast between the Apollonian and the Dionysian spirit. So Apollo versus Dionysus. And Dionysus is associated again with wine, merrymaking, emotional expression. At the same time, extreme of Dionysian leads to madness, even ritual sacrifice, craze, orgies, destruction of society. Apollonian relates to measured, rational thinking, the beauty in art in terms of symmetry, form, and things like that. And so the Apollonian Dionysian sort of set into a binary battle. And so the Apollonian, any one of these, if you look at Greece, the idea that these things should be in balance, right? So you do have emotional expression. You should have outlets. Same time, you should maintain clarity, rationality, symbolic relationships that make sense. So from 462 to 429, known as the Age of Pericles, was really where a lot of these important things developed that we really have a lot of the basis for our society today. So we have birth of democracy, arts, literature, philosophy, and there's also a very important development of drama, of performative expression as a means of social transformation. So tragedy, which we all familiar with, like Aeschylus, and of course Freud is drawing on Oedipus and things like that. But the idea, the end result of tragedy was not to uproot the social system, but actually to embrace the joy and pain of life, the ecstasy, the agony, the rationality, the whatever you want to call it, the whole life story, and create an end result known as harmonia, which is harmony, and symphronesia, which is symphony, not sympathy, but symphony. This idea of creating a mutually vibrant society with everyone able to express themselves, but also working in harmony, just as in the idea of musical symphony comes from that symphonoresnasias. And I probably mangled that, but I'm not wearing my glasses, so, we'll look it up. And then if you look at this idea of the Dionysian, if you look at the 60s rock, would that not be considered the era of Dionysian excess, Jan?
I would most certainly say so. And you think of Woodstock, and I mean, shoot, I even interviewed this guy years ago, Chris Knowles, who wrote a whole book on how rock and roll was based on the Dionysian mysteries. Of course, he wasn't exposing much of this. To him, it was just kind of, well, gee, how did this all happen, I think,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's certainly the case. Second, I want to turn on my power here. No, exactly. And so you have someone like, let's look at Jim Morrison, right? I'm the Lizard King. I am embodying the Dionysian spirit of of the world. And this whole idea of excess, of breaking the boundaries, of breaking the barriers. And in fact, I myself, I was kind of enamored with that idea of being Dionysian. But then if you go a little bit deeper, you find that if you look at the Hellfire Club or all these other places, you go to Aleister Crowley, they're even reviving some of these Dionysian ancient rituals. Now, we're not getting the full story when we see, Jim Morrison or whoever it may be, Janis Joplin or Syd Barrett, another great example of Dionysian freedom, right? Ending up, 50 years old, overweight, absolutely insane, living with your mom. But but anyways, so this idea of this Dionysian excess, right? And now I'll just make a statement here that I'm not opposed to natural social ebb and flow. I think that there are places for, revivifying society, for breaking, with past systems and then coming back to them. However, what happens, at least what I would stipulate, is that a lot of times the natural energy of the 60s was transformed into this sort of hedonistic never land, which had, of course, as we've been talking about, had far-reaching effects. So, but we do look at philosophy. I always say it's very important to understand Greek philosophy, go back to the classics, read some of these works because they're great, not only great works, but they'll give you a grounding and you'll start to understand what these people in the elite levels are understanding in terms of how they're basing their decisions.
Yeah, well, they don't study rocker philosophy. They study the classics. They study the great books of the Western world. I mean,
exactly.
So if you want to know how the world is run, maybe you should stop studying rocker philosophy,
Yeah, and that's exactly goes back to the point I made in the beginning, is that you get this sort of dumbed down, superficial little catchphrase, political campaign button version of something. And in fact, what the elites are practicing and their understanding of that is far different and far deeper. And all the fact is, when you think you're, going G.G. Allen or whatever and being free, you're actually getting the little junior version of the elites without not only any of the background, but out any of the power. And so this idea of sort of inculcating people into their belief systems, but generally speaking, again, on a much lower level. So again, going back to, the crack dealer, listening to Snoop Dogg, who goes out and shoots somebody, his ethos is not far removed from someone, setting out drone missions and killing a bunch of innocent people. However, this guy is a total victim of the system, and he just embraces this, and not, instead of being an active participant in changing the world, becomes another mechanized cog in the great machine of the clockwork man.
All right, so let's dive into part 5, Lacan and the mirror stage.
Yeah, Lacan, I think, is really important because Lacan, we sort of get a nuanced look and an actual modeling or a mapping of how art works. Now, and this is, again, Adorno talked about this in the Princeton Radio Project, and this idea of the mirror. So the idea of the mirror is represented in the infant through the mother primary caregiver. And this produces a psychic response that gives rise to a mental representation of the I. So the idea is mirroring. As a child, you mirror the other, your father, mother, and the infant identifies with the image, and this becomes a gestalt, right? This becomes a holistic framing of the infant's emerging perceptions of selfhood. But the image of a unified body does not correspond with the underdeveloped infant's vulnerability and weakness. This becomes developed as an idealized I that one can never live up to, but it also serves as an inner representation of the self. Again, we have this divided self, but we have this malleable perception of ourselves in our mind. So we have this idea of the mind itself becoming a mirror. We have an identity which actually encompasses motor, sensory, perception, etc., which can actually be manipulated. So the evolution of Lacan's idea is the fact that this mirror stage, especially if people are not able to fully develop psychologically, emotionally, physically, etc., this mirror stage can be continually manipulated throughout the person's life without them necessarily being aware of it. So when Adorno talks about the popular song and the listener identifying with the person in the song and actually mirroring that in their own mind and sort of identifying that as an idealized psychological state and actually modifying their own inner sense of I, or changing this mirror image, which is what they strive for. And so this idea of the mirror, but again, we have to look at the fact that, there are psychological phenomena. There is an inner space. And these are people that have attempted to map and understand it. While some, like Freud, are much more mechanistic, others, like Lacan, have made some pretty important discoveries, at least in terms of manipulation. So Lacan stuff has been used heavily in advertising, propaganda. We look at music video, and I can give you reams of stats on showing drug abuse, violence, premarital sex, and how this directly influences the viewers of these music videos. And you start seeing like 85, 95% of videos showing these types of behavior, and you look at how it influences the people watching them, why they're influenced, because this is working on this idea of this mirror state. So we're taking partially, I would argue, because we haven't been able to fully develop psychologically, and we sort of have these parts of ourselves that are almost trapped in kind of infantile or adolescent zones, that these things beamed into us become part of this inner image that we have of ourselves that transforms how we see ourselves or what we see as an ideal, or can even change our behavior without us being aware of it. And also, I think this might reflect too if you look at satanic and occult imagery. So we're looking at these videos in a sense, especially again, if one is not developed enough to be aware of what's happening, this will operate on this sort of subconscious fractured plane where we went and mirrored our parents, but yet we couldn't be like them because we're just little babies. So we can't be like the rock stars. We can't be like, these people, they're set apart from us. They're celebrity. So the whole idea of this cult of personality, of celebrity, is also sort of bouncing off this idea of Lacan's work. And again, certainly a development of Lacan's work, because Lacan, like Freud, kind of was sort of stuck with mother-child relationships. But I think that he's very important to understanding music and mind control.
All right, so let's get into behaviorism and the so-called mechanical man.
Okay. So when we look at these psychological techniques and how they're deployed, if you look at all of these ideas have a type of pedigree. A lot of these things are still going, whether or not they've been totally discredited, right? So this idea of the mechanical man, again, we find this very much in sort of Enlightenment thinking. You can see it in Francis Bacon. You can see it in, you see it very much so in Darwin. You see it very much so in Freud. You see it very much so in Descartes, B.F. Skinner, Jose Delgado, right? And this continues on to today. And so the thing about this particular model of behaviorism, which I'm sure you've covered this in detail, so I'll just be pretty brief about it. It can be very, very effective for certain types of subjects, right? Certain types of people are very malleable to behaviorist types of manipulations, and especially simple conditioning processes, and especially used in conjunction with some type of whether an addiction, if you're an alcoholic, or you're a sexaholic, or a video gameaholic, you're in a certain extent, you're being victimized by people using types of operant conditioning on you, and creating sort of an addictive mechanism. And if we look at, Charles Darwin, again, we have this model, which, I won't get necessarily Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, we all familiar with him, and this, eugenics idea clearly embedded within his thinking, or B.F. Skinner, with Walden II, his nice little, behavioristic, mechanistic, utopian world, or Jose Delgado, who went from using simple external stimuli to working directly on the brain. Let's have fun with the brain, and let's find out what these circuits do. Let's use, types of radio frequency patterns to manipulate behavior of monkeys and maybe even people. But this behaviorist model is also very, very important, especially when the stimulus response mechanism is subconsciously embedded. It becomes entrained. And as I mentioned before, a lot of how this works is that culture itself, for most of human history, was sort of it's sort of like we're fish and the culture is the water we're swimming in. So except for a very limited segment of the population, we're not necessarily even going to be aware we're in a culture, right? We're not going to be aware of that. And when you have these fully top-down manipulated cultural systems, this becomes very, very powerful and extremely effective for this, systems.
God is the ultimate clockmaker. Isn't
Well,
that kind of an irony or an ironic statement? It's like God and clockmaker because one is life and the other one is sort of the antithesis. It's the ultimate control.
exactly. And this is where, going back to my first point, we see a little bit of the crossover sort of between religious or occult ideas and scientific technotronic control grid. So this was a belief system, in the scientific revolution. I mean, the idea was that God basically created all these mechanisms and just let them go. Hey, I've got my little wind up creatures, they're all moving. And then the idea, of course, since God can create and manipulate these things, why can't we? Especially if you go back to Pico del Mirandola and believing that this idea of inverting the tree of life, which I'll talk about when we get to the Beatles.
Sure, and that is the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is based on the tree of life, the fallen tree and the standing tree, and even that is misrepresented in most people's study of the Kabbalah.
Yeah, and then, we won't get into Gnosticism and this idea, you get this, dualistic idea, and then you have the idea that material reality is evil, but this idea of science, I mean, God is the ultimate clockmaker, and we have become like gods, right? We are now like gods. So there you go. There's Monsanto for you, right? On the other hand, you wonder how people could, manipulate create incredible tragedies. I mean, look at just the devastation, wrecked across the generations by, the massive deployment of drugs in the 1960s. And, in the way that people are still like, hey, man, that was my era. I love it, bro.
Well, yeah, and well said, but it goes all the way back to the British importing opium, and probably long before then it goes back, obviously, to the assassins and everything else.
Yeah, and but one thing to state is that with the scientific revolution, with the Enlightenment, we have this imposition of a mechanistic model. So even before with someone like Hassani Saba or these other things, they still, in a sense, were in awe of the forces of the universe and didn't necessarily presuppose that they could fully control them, except when you go into Chaldean black magic and some of these other pretty far out, ancient sects that, again, I can trace all this stuff directly through all these viewpoints. But yeah, I mean, you look at the idea of that God is the ultimate clockmaker, or seeing yourself, manifest destiny, seeing yourself as you mentioned the British and the opium trade in India. They went in. India had the greatest weavers in the planet. They went and cut off the thumbs of all the weavers, and it made them import saris made in manufactured in factories in India. Right? To do that, what kind of mindset does it take? They took that as their divine right, as they're looking at human beings as mechanical subjects, and in fact, entire social structures as things that can be manipulated. And then Kurt Llewellyn is also talking about the plasticity of the social, exact same viewpoint, right? So again, it's important to understand that this is a viewpoint that's been around for a long time, and in fact, many people today and again, you can believe in this stuff and be a total atheist. It's more of a systemic understanding of how life works and what your rights are to control and manipulate life. I'll just keep going here.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
And in this model, Gilbert Ryle, a philosopher psychologist, says in this model, human consciousness is a ghost haunting a machine. And I think the idea of a ghost haunting the machine, is that not?
Well, and that goes back to Ghost in the Machine by what's his name? Arthur Koester.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
becomes Ghost in the Machine album by the Police. That was directly out of Arthur Koester, who, of course, worked with Huxley and the CIA and the Esalen Institute and all of this crap.
Yeah, no, exactly. And again, but this, the idea of a ghost haunting the machine is that, going back to the quote from Henry Murray, it's like a stripping away of everything that is beautiful. I mean, again, I'm someone who has gone through, a variety of different, belief systems. I mean, not, I never got into, I never got into transgenderism or anything, but, I mean, I sort of started to believe in this sort of deconstructionist model, and even saying, well, who are the ancient Greeks? There's nothing. What's literature? It's nothing. Our idea is powerful? No. But when you take this idea of being a rebel and smashing everything, you end up literally as a ghost. You've cut yourself off from all actual nourishing facets of life and actually have become your mind has become a ghost. And
the automaton, the automatic machine that just, they're programming you. That's what it's all about. That's why they want everybody following rocker philosophy and not reading the classics and all of this stuff, isn't it?
Yep. And let me just summarize this section here with a quote from James Mill. You familiar with James Mill at all?
No.
Okay, James Mill was a 19th century. He's born in 1760 something approximately, but he was a historian, sort of philosopher. But this is a quote from James Mill, which I think typifies and exemplifies this belief system. Quote, "I seek to destroy the illusion of psychical activity, to reduce everything to constant and in some sort mechanical relationship between elements which should be as simple as possible." So this is his goal as a proto-early psychologist, to destroy the illusion of any type of autonomy. And this is from the analysis of the phenomena of the human mind, James Mill. And again, can you get a little more direct statement than that? I don't think so. I mean, you can, but I mean, that's, at least he's not framing it as some kind of positive, let's save the world, poppycock. Okay, I'll just finish this up. So, and we find this operant conditioning in the educational system of punishment and rewards. The school bell, the class periods. You get a reward, you get your A, you get your smiley.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, the school bell in our American education system comes from Pavlov. So, I mean, it's clearly based on conditioning, and it's actually designed to break up concentration and thinking into little segments. So it can be hard to get out of that when you've been conditioned to thought in this, dog think from Pavlov. You're for 12 years going through school.
Yeah, and again, as I said, that imagine you're in a classroom, and the bell goes off. So not only are you conditioned to get up and move to the next thing, but everyone else is doing it. So if you decide to say, hey, wait, why should I don't feel like getting up. I'm interested, but that bell almost becomes a subconscious stimuli that you're not really even consciously aware of. You don't consciously think, why is there a bell? Why do we have these, things? And then also at the same time, your idea of conforming with the group. And then you sort of kind of positions you within a hive mind or a group mind, which there's one of my favorite clips of this of all time is from the Beatles video of I Am a Walrus, where it shows all the Eggmen in this sort of human centipede formation, which exactly describes how that stuff works. And so, let me just go in here. And would you like me to touch on, and there's a huge amount of research on this, from Soviet era experiments on their...
Sure, and there was, Soviet mind control, Soviet psychedelic studies as well. We might as well touch on that for a moment, and then we'll jump into Artie Lang.
Okay, yeah. So, I'll just read some quotes because, like I said, I always like to read quotes that sort of typify these things. So. And let me just give a nice quote from Delgado. I think Jose Delgado is certainly the merging of this idea of God as the ultimate clockmaker, and using this again with a very mechanistic, but the idea of understanding electricity and how the brain operates on electrical signal. So this is a quote from Jose Delgado, quote, "The discovery that living organs could be influenced by instrumental manipulations directed by the will of a human being brought about a revision of the traditional concepts of vitalism." Again, vitalism is this idea of biological energy, and the discovery they thought there was some kind of innate life force. Now, this hasn't been thrown out the door. Remember, if you look at bioenergetics, I talked about Kundalini energy. Certain people are still drawing on these earlier models, and they may indeed have some veracity. But this is from Evolution of the Physical Control of the Brain. But the idea is, again, instrumental manipulations directed by the will of a human being. So we have this idea of breaking free from these primitive concepts and realizing, hey, we can stimulate this part of the brain. We can make someone's leg jump up or whatever. Another just Jose Delgado quote, which is from a real nice declassified Air Force document, UHF simulation system. So this is a UHF simulation system used to remotely control chimpanzees and possibly the people at this Air Force base. So quote, in addition, individual and social behavior have been continuously recorded day and night by time-lapse photography. Radio techniques represent an important step towards physical control of the brain, providing an essential tool for behavioral studies, and it may be safely predicted that within a few years, telestimulation may spread to most brain research institutes. We can also expect the new developments in microelectronics, including integrated circuits and thin film techniques, will facilitate the construction of multi-channel radio-activated stimulators, reduced in size to a few millimeters. The limits of brain control do not seem to depend on electronic technology, but on the biological properties of living neurons. Now, that doesn't send a little chill down your spine when you think about your little handheld cell phone and all that stuff. You know, I'll dance. That'll send a chill down your spine. But I'll just finish this up. This is again from this declassified document, and this is from '63. Okay. Again, quote, a UHF, ultra high frequency, remote simulation system working the 915 megahertz band is described. This is the abstract, which generates current pulses in 3 stimulation channels. The amplitude, duration, repetition rate, and channel can be controlled from a remotely located control panel. The system has been installed at Holman Air Force Base, New Mexico, to simulate the brain of free-ranging chimpanzees and study the influence of induced modifications on individuals and social behavior. So think of the idea of 24-hour surveillance and remote manipulation. And again, this is a declassified document, but just to get an understanding, and again, this is pretty old in terms of being 1963, but again, this has been a lot of work in these areas. And you want me to continue? You want to throw something in there?
Oh, I was going to say, well, go ahead.
Okay, no, go ahead, please.
Oh, well, do you want to jump over to Artie Lang and the Tavistock Institute?
Sure. And I know that this has been my albatross around my neck, but I will certainly, in the next part, we're going to go deeply into the Soviet mind control experiments and tie this in with a whole bunch of other stuff. So I just gave a little bit of flavor of that, but I've got a huge ream of all kinds of stuff that I want to give people, again, a grounding in the psychology before we hit it. So anyways, including various fun patents. Let me just give one Lowry patent number 6052336, quote, apparatus and method of broadcasting audible sound using ultrasonic sound as a carrier, non-lethal weapons utilized, quote, since most cultures attribute inner voices either as signs of madness or messages from spirits or demons, both of which evoke powerful emotional reactions. This particular device may cause temporary incapacitation, intense feelings of discomfort, entrainment techniques, etc. So I would say that in a lot of these patents, if you look at them, I would say that, especially if you go to the Princeton Radio Project and Burris Meyer's research on light and sound and his little experimental theater, which occasionally had to be shut down because he induced such tremendous panic. This, I wonder how many of these rock concerts have had, at least in part, some type of this technology being tested, as, Burning Man, right? Burning Man is a mass open air psychology experiment. And so go to Burning Man. I'm sure, in fact, we got to go next year, Jan. So let's hit it.
All right. Well, there you go. So we'll be there as sort of social anthropologists, there to study what they're doing. I mean, that's the only thing that's not getting reported to the public about Burning Man. So there's all these psychologists there too. It's unfortunate that none of them are reporting this, but obviously a lot of them know what's going on.
Yeah. And well, let's leave that aside. And yeah, so just going into just a couple more different psychological systems that I'll get into more detail when we actually do our music analysis. Okay, Artie Lang. Artie Lang is a very influential psychologist because he looked at this idea of the schizoid split, or also known as this idea of schismogenesis, which is a really fun concept of creating sort of split off personality segments, and this idea that we all are, in a certain sense, schizophrenic. Actually, society itself may be schizophrenic, and in fact, the schizophrenic person may indeed be sane. Hey, let's try some LSD and have a schismo. These are weird words. These are like these neologisms you guys come up with. But a schismogenic experience. That's exactly. So you look at Artie Lang sort of softening the ground for these. What's that other name for schizophrenogens? Right, that was another name for the
exactly psychedelics, schizophrenogens, psychotomimetics, which is psychosis mimicking. That's what they called them before they marketed them to magical, spiritual experience causing psychedelics and entheogens is the intel community's latest manifestation.
Yeah, and so with Artie Lang, we also have this thing. We'll look at the cybernetic loop, right? Cybernetic loop in the mind, and you know what? Actually schismogenesis, I think, is actually Bateson's term, but Artie Lang and Bateson are coming to the idea that this schizoid break, and these mixed messages, multiple layered language, which we're going to see all this stuff in just a few seconds here in two wonderful musical examples. So Artie Lang, we'll touch on a bit later, but very interesting person in psychology. Again, this idea of insanity is normal and sort of an embrace of schizophrenia, 21st century schizoid man, King Crimson, et cetera, and very much, again, a countercultural psychologist with the light version for the masses and the deeper version for those behind the scenes in their mansions with their giant harems and whatever the hell they do on Saturday night, because I don't know. They don't invite me over. And then I'll just bounce on that next one, which I think we could serve to, maybe we'll talk about on the radio, but Carl Jung and the collective unconscious. Carl Jung is a very, very important psychologist. Again, another disciple of Freud that broke away from Freud and actually had some major conflicts with Freud, which is sort of understanding given the fact that Freud was just running this massive cult of personality based on this sort of hierarchical conditioning mechanisms and basically making people worship him as a living god. But Carl Jung came up with this very, very important idea. Again, he has a much more complex model of the mind, which I won't get into in detail, but his important ideas were that of archetypal energies. Basically, there's a collective unconscious, there's a personal unconscious, and then there's a collective unconscious, and there's certain types of archetypal forms. And one of my friends who actually knew his dad worked with Carl Jung, and I asked him about archetypes, and he said basically archetypes are almost like the psychological equivalent of chemical compounds, in that they are basal structures that, again, given the nature of the archetype, it's operating so deeply in the mind. It's very hard to actually access that in yourself without having a massive sort of eruption of energy or whatever. But if you look at, we can go through the whole idea of mythos and the hero and all this and that. But within the archetypes, you're really looking at sort of based.
That was Joseph Campbell, who worked with SRI and MK Ultra. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So when you start to manipulate these things, and then when I get into John Lilly's programming manual of the mind, of the subject, LSD actually opened up a lot of doors for this type of research because it was, but anyways, line and flotation.
Because it's causing hypersuggestion to allow them to get in there and look at all this.
But also allowing the psychologists to explore their own subconscious mind and understand all these different inner worlds, which is exactly what Llewellyn was talking about, but he may not have had the means to do it. But anyways, so the collective unconscious, again, is this shared, either it can be considered a racial, cultural memory, a human memory with these different forms that can be accessed. Look at our media, perennial rolling out of basic hero and villain archetypes. You can see the archetypal roles all over the media, and especially as it becomes more and more dumbed down, the nuances and reference points become distilled. But if you wonder why people get so, like Obama, the Obama frenzy, how people got so hypnotized by Obama. Well, Obama, in a lot of ways, they're working off archetypal energies. And you go to something that's almost like a primal human urge or instinct, and you start to work with that or manipulate that or invoke it. You invoke the response, and then you give the stimulus, and you relate people to this particular stimulus point. And so this response is geared toward what you set up as the target point, and then you can do all kinds of fun stuff with that. Another thing Jung talks about is the shadow. The shadow is a lot of times used to justify sort of like even dark shamanic practices. Well, hey, the Satanist stuff, they're just working with their shadows, man, I mean, the satanic, you got to accept it. You can't fight it. You got to explore it and come to terms with it and come to grips with it. Well, the shadow self, I think, is certainly there. However, and again, you have the pop psychology version of Jung, where the shadow should be embraced. You embrace the dark side. You embrace this stuff, and it's all good fun, etc. And then soul image, we'll move on from that because that's a lot more detailed. But that's a crash course in sort of some very important thought systems and paradigms in contemporary psychology. And I hope in that little, freight train, we were able to kind of outline the stuff. And
All right, so Hans and I just took a break for a few minutes, and now we're starting part 2 of, or section 2 of part 6, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, let's dive into this analysis of music. We were going to start off with this children's record called The Little Puppet, and from the Children's Record Guild from the early 1950s.
Yeah, and this recording, let me just give a little background. Children's Record Guild supplied many records, usually sometimes free at very low cost rates, to kindergartens, elementary schools throughout the country. And a lot of times these were, they were played for kids. This particular piece is a dance song. You imagine that you're a 5-year-old kid, lights are out, and then your teacher gets you up and they put this song on. So if you want to go ahead and roll the song, and I'll break it down after that.
Here we go.
Say, how would you look if I turned you into a puppet? First I tie the strings for your head, then strings for your hands and legs, then abracadabraca, pipply-poo, sub-gum, you're all wooden. Here's a puppet boy, he's all wood from head to toe, and here's a puppet girl, she's as wooden as the boy. Here's a puppet boy, he's all wood from head to toe, and here's a puppet girl, she's as wooden as the boy. Now I'm going to pull all the strings and make you move. Little puppet, walk with your legs and arms so stiff. Oh, little puppet, walk like a funny wooden doll. Little puppet, walk with your legs and arms so stiff. Oh, little puppet, walk like a funny wooden doll. to one side, then the other. Turn your head, 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 like a funny wooden doll. Turn your head, 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 first to one side, then the other. Turn your head, 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 like a funny wooden doll. Lift your arms up high, lift them up and down, you drop them. Lift your arms up high like a funny wooden doll. Lift your arms up high, lift them up and down, you drop them. Lift your arms up high like a funny wooden doll. Drop them. Touch your toes, toes, toes. Keep your arms and legs so wooden. Touch your toes, toes, toes. Can you touch them with your nose? Lower. Still lower. Boom! Did you fall, little puppet? Here's something puppets do that always makes me laugh. It happens when I loosen the strings, and my puppet falls down, all loose and floppy. Down you flop, flop, flop. Up I pull you up again, and down you flop, 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 like a droopy floppy doll. Down you flop, flop, flop. Up I pull you up again, and down you flop, 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 like a droopy floppy doll. I wonder how funny you would look if you did a floppy dance. Little puppet dance with your wiggly flippity legs. Oh, little puppet dance like
I think everybody gets the idea by now. There's another minute and 50 seconds of that, but
it's a little tweaked out more towards the end. But so let's just bring in the mind that if you're in 1953 and you're 5 years old, when the Beatles come to America, you're going to be 15. And the next piece we look at comes out, you're going to be, 19, right? So, first of all, Jan, what did you think of that song? Again, keeping in mind that you're a little kid and you're not in the massive music environment we are today. Imagine what kind of effect that would have for you. You wake up from your nap and suddenly, lights are out and you're dancing around like that. What do you think of that song?
I mean, it's wow, but to get that, I mean, it's obviously degrading to everyone or to every child, but then to have that programmed in you as a child is basically telling you that you're a worthless little puppet from, the age of, you're just there on the strings. And now what if you do the floppy dance and all of that? So then I get where you're going, because the next stage, the mop heads come in and do the floppy dance, and those children have about perfectly grown up. How many years was that? What year was that put out compared to when the Beatles came out?
Yeah, I mean, this is early 50s, so from like 51 to like 54, 55, so we're looking at basically, and again, kindergarten through third grade. So you've got the exact generation that would have been there for the Beatles, and then, again, for the psychedelic generation. So these are people who would be 18, 19 years old during the Summer of Love, So if you look, okay, so let's just kind of break this down a bit. So first of all, and again, we have to remember that we're pretty dulled musically in terms of understanding the effect this stuff has on us. But first of all, there's a great deal of hypnotic suggestion within the song. So this song basically presents a powerful array of various types of hypnotic suggestions, which in a certain way also precludes the idea that I can pull your strings. I'm controlling you. I'm standing outside of you. I'm the puppet master, right? So there's various levels of hypnosis going on within the song that, you know, at a later date, we can maybe break through the various kind of types of command languages in there. But first of all, so you look at Bateson and R.D. Laing, this idea of the schizoid, the break between, you have this loop, right? A communicative loop where you cannot act. It's something that's impossible, yet it's presented as a reality. So creating sort of a psychic split. At the same time, your body image, you're dissociated from your body. So it's really designed to create an extreme state of dissociation, right? So your body, you're not visualizing your body as a fluid, you're not, it's not like a yoga relaxation where you're floating on an ocean of clouds. No, you're a wooden doll that's being jerked around by these strings above you, right? So, and then there's these distortions of size, right? So you look at a little Alice in Wonderland phenomena, large and small, touch your toes with your nose, which is impossible. So you're being commanded to do something which you can't do, creating the psychic split. At the same time, lie down, go up, all these movement arrays. I mean, it might be fun to kind of reenact the movements and see how you felt. But I mean, even the movements themselves, turn your head from side to side. It's very odd types of movements. And if you look at this almost as a model for the freak dancing in the 1960s, you can say, hey, that's almost like the puppet song.
I should say, I'm sure there are some people, so we don't get emails about this, that some people can touch their toes to their nose. Well, I don't know about standing, but you could at least do it sitting down.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can, but also, it's sort of a stress position, right? I mean, yeah, there's, super flexible people. I know I have friends who can do the splits, whatever. But I'm just saying, as a general sense, there's a lot of weird movements, right? And then you mentioned already, so temporal distortions, right? So we notice, like, within the music itself. So a lot of this is actually happening, what's going on musically. You have these different odd modulations of key, right? And you have time slowing down and speeding up. So there's also this idea, which is looked into by Soviets and, American psychologists and other people, the idea of how we talked about entrainment, right? So you're kind of going fast, you're going slow. So you're getting this kind of spatial temporal distortion. So it's kind of like a bad trip, but it's just for kids. So it's fun. And then we have psychic shocks being administered. So that whistle, that penny whistle, what that's doing is sending up literally like a bolt of electricity up your spine. Like it's like almost like a terrifying response when you're in the middle of doing this weird dance in your daycare or your school. So there's certain stress trigger points that are embedded in there as well. So that penny whistle, there's a lot of very dissonant music. Like it doesn't really sound like a kid song, does it? I mean, it's pretty dark. If you look at the tonality of it, even the instrumentation, you've got these kind of weird high-pitched wooden blocks with that sound of wood. So that there's it's almost like you're being sonally objectified, meaning that through the sound reference point, you're almost becoming like a wooden block that's being played on. Again, I won't get too much into the musicological analysis, but again, so you have rhythmic changes, you have time dissonances, and then you have lack of harmonic resolution or resolution on weird places, which again we've talked about all the psychology. So people should know that has a powerful psychic effect, especially if you're a child or especially if you're tripping on LSD. So, or whatever, if you're reduced to that state of receptivity.
Sure.
And 3 minutes and 23 seconds, again, we have this entrainment and also use of atonality, shifting to minor keys. So you have a lot of the techniques we see with, parallel tonality, atonality, some modern compositional techniques being employed with kind of an odd timbral spectra. So even the timbral spectra of the song is part of its whole package. So that's just kind of a basic outline of that, but I just want to let people know, again, this is being submitted to kids, submitted for school teachers to play for their kids. And so, like I said, if someone wants me to, write a super detailed analysis of this, I'd be happy to do it, going through all the musical stuff. But we're looking at is, what if you hear this every day in your kindergarten and you're a groggy, state after your nap? I mean, this can have a powerful psychic effect. And you look at the Lacanian mirror. So the authority figure, the teacher, your mirroring of your self-identity is being shifted into seeing yourself as this puppet with this sort of voice of God that's controlling you from outside with these very awkward, sort of uncomfortable movements that are being stimulated in a very stress-producing musical environment with occasional respites from the stress. But basically, you're producing. It's almost like a you know, like a little Ewan Cameron routine in a short piece of music for kids. Anyways, that's just one example of that. But let me just jump up into Strawberry Fields Forever, which is really, again, another one of those wonderful John Lennon songs that he wrote remembering his childhood in a place he used to play. So let's go ahead, and there's a music video of this. You can also listen to the original song, but why don't you roll just a bit of that music video? All right.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So that's it. Basically everything that the children's song says encompassed into a Beatles rock video.
Exactly. And this is what's really weird about it. So we look at Bateson when he talks about this idea creating a cybernetic loop, a neuroperceptual maze that is a self-exciting system, right? And this, well, that's a little bit of a larger explanation of it, but basically, so let's just look at a little symbolism in the video. Okay, first of all, you have this backwards movement, right? So they're going forwards and going backwards. And that's a big part. Crowley talked about saying backwards, writing everything backwards, thinking backwards. Very important thing. You have this reverse temporal loop, right? So it's almost like this time loop is being constructed. There's this weird red light in the tree, right? It's like a stoplight, strange red light. I don't know if you got that point in the video, but basically, and then you have these piano strings, which are spread. The piano, the innards of the piano are spread out as a spider web or like a maze, like to capture you, right? So the spider web, the piano strings are hanging from the tree, right? So we have this idea of the tree. And then this idea, nothing to get hung about. It's not nothing. I used to think it's nothing to get hung up about. It's nothing to get hung about in the tree, the hanged man, right? This idea of the symbolic death, either death of the self, whether it's Timothy Leary's Tibetan Book of the Dead, or whether it's, you know, the death of yourself as a member of the society and breaking with the authority figures, whatever. But there's certainly a reference to this type of death. And then within this song, well, I'll get into the music a bit later, but one more thing is that we have, like, and on the tree, there's 13 beads on that little power line. So you got 13 beads. Nice, powerful sort of satanic number that's tying these threads down to the psychedelic painted piano. And there's all kinds of different one-eyed stuff. There's weird close-ups of John Lennon's ear, his single eye, and then there's these weird discolorations that we see. And then, musically, there's a whole bunch of weird dissonances in this song. Okay, number one, what we have is two recordings were actually merged. They recorded the song twice and stuck both songs together. So there's actually two versions of the song playing at the same time. And so they're not quite aligned. So you actually have this odd combination of two different recordings of the same song being played. Sometimes the other parts are going backwards, but you have these two versions of the song, again, almost kind of mirroring this, Batesonian, schizoid split within the song. And let's just look at the lyrics, and I get a little bit more in the music as we go on. But so what this song is actually creating lyrically, you're creating a double bind. Right, this song is the ultimate, not the ultimate, it's a wonderful example of a double bind. Along with you have distorted and dissonant music at occasional moments, and again, especially if you just dropped a tab of Owsley's Best Acid, this song is going to have far more powerful effect than us sitting here right now. So again, keep that in mind. So first of all, we have Let Me Take You Down, classic hypnotic suggestion, right? Let me take you down. And normally, in musical terms, let me take you down, you're going back down to the key center, right? We're going to get down. We're going back to the one. In this case, they're going to a different altered key center. Let me take you down. So musically, you're being removed from your day-to-day life. So you got a post-hypnotic command, let me take you down because I'm going to Strawberry Fields. Okay, and then suddenly we have this kind of upward modulation of the music, nothing to get hung about. So nothing to get hung about. So this idea of hung, what does it mean to get hung about? We're not talking about hung up. We're talking about nothing to get hung about. We have the tree metaphor, which is clearly present in the video. And believe me, if you analyze the song musicologically, again, we've all heard it.
Well, and there's of course, the obvious biblical ties to Jesus being hung on the cross, and in some versions, a tree as well.
100%, Jan. Thank you for bringing that out. You got this mythological reference, nothing to get hung about. You're free. You're free from this sacrifice. You're in this sort of floaty, dreamy realm, but it's kind of like the little puppet realm in a certain way, right? It's not quite as dreamy and floaty as it may seem on the surface, right? So again, if your Lacanian inner mirror is active, you are also, the Beatles in itself become sort of your authority figures. They're guiding and working on your inner psychological spaces. So let's just look at the lyrics a little more. Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me. Classic double binds right there. We have statements, confusion of meaning, confusion of figure and ground. We have two levels of contrasting meaning that are creating this sort of psychological, sort of cybernetic loop, especially, again, you grew up with the Beatles, you idolize them. They, Go ahead.
I was going to add that, for the audience, they should know that we've also covered Bateson's Double Bind extensively in the Roundtable series with Bill Jocelyn and Joe Atwill and Ryan, etc. So definitely check those out because we expand on the ideas of the double bind and how that was used essentially as social control.
Yeah, excellent. And that'd be a great reference point to check that out. So, and then again, he's saying it's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. So these are people questing for their identity, right? People are probably very confused. They may have left home, have this whole social upheaval, but it all works out, but it doesn't matter much to me. So he's also at the same time dismissing the audience. So you have this bringing closer and then just like the puppet master kind of slapping the audience down. And then we go, let me take you down because I'm going to Strawberry Fields. Now we have an increased dissonance. We have these weird backwards stereo effects. It's almost like you're going down this pit or this tunnel with a lot of jarring sounds, right? Sounds that are not placed in the music, but just like that penny whistle we heard already, these are creating this sort of a tension. And then this idea of Strawberry Fields forever. So you're kind of trapped in this strawberry field. You're trapped in this psychological space, just like the ghost haunting the machine, right? You're sort of psychedelically disembodied, psychedelically schizophrenic. And then no one I think is in my tree. Okay. And when no one I think is in my tree, you have British brass bands, right? So you have a nice little normal section of the song, so to speak, with British brass bands. Very important part. Every village would have their brass bands. So you grew up in a village in England, you'd hear these bands, right? It was sort of, even in America, so it's associated with sort of traditional values, right? But no one, I think, is in my tree. I mean, it must be high or low. No one, I think, is in my tree. There's no savior. You want to go the Christian metaphor. At the same time, it must be high or low. Inversion of high and low, right? You go back to the inverting the tree of life, inverting values, but then you also have this
the Yggdrasil tree.
Yeah. Go ahead. You can.
Oh no, that's all I was going to say. The Yggdrasil tree,
Yeah.
And it expands from above down below, and whatever. Okay.
Yeah. And at the same time, where you have that brass band, you have this little intercut of like some backwards music, right? So you have these little weird historical reference points of kind of like a hurdy-gurdy in the beginning, or like a carnival, almost like a carnival sound, right? So you can see these musical elements are also being sort of employed as symbolic or psychological sort of acting points or reference points. And then we'll go. I'll go back to this. I think it must be high or low. Okay, no one I think is in my tree. I mean, it must be high or low. I mean, Okay, so this is a little complex. That is, you can't know, tune in, but it's all right. So you can't know. You can't know anything. There's no knowledge, there's no ground. Tune in, right? Tune in, turn on, drop out, but it's all right. So another kind of self-referencing 60s thing, it's going to be all right, the kids are all right, everything's all right.
Knowledge is bad, Jiddu Krishnamurti et al.
Yeah, that is, next line, that is, I think it's not too bad. So what do we have there? Do we have just Jesus?
Right, it's a total dumbing down. It's don't think. It's, it's total top-down social control sold in a, nice little tune there.
But at the same time, we have hypnotic language, right? Where we have if you look at this idea of this symbolic consciousness, you're actually operating sort of on the mind in a subconscious plane. So there's sort of embedded, sort of hypnotic suggestions, but there's also a revelation of the method, so to speak. Again, revelation of the method means they show you what you're doing, and if you don't stand up, if you're not aware of it, then that mind control technique has just assumed that much more power, or whatever it is, occult technique, etc. Okay, so, but that is, I think it's not too bad. So he's constantly, I think he's constantly contradicting himself. He's created all these binaries, and yet he's juxtaposing them with this sort of hey, it's all right. But at the same time, it's also creating this, again, you get this non-space. So the Strawberry Fields realm is the next verse, the next musical interlude, it gets even more dissonant. So you go down further and further into this trip, into the hypnotic suggestion realm, and it's more and more disturbing. Nothing is real, nothing to get hung about. Nothing is real. Everything is permitted, right?
Last words of the old man on the mountain.
Hassani Saba, whatever, but nothing is real. There's no reality. And there's no redemption. And there's just this strawberry field la la land. And then just always, no, sometimes think it's me. Always, no, sometimes think it's me. Wait, what does that mean? Always, all the time. No, sometimes. I think it's me, but I don't even know who I am. So now you have a destabilization, even of personal identity, of any kind of psychic grounding. But I know when it's a dream. But I know when it's a dream. So that I'm the operator, I'm the puppet master. But I know when it's a dream, and when I know it's a dream. But you may not know it's a dream, right? Again, hypnotic suggestion, it's a dream. So we got, again, all this stuff. I think I know I mean a yes, but it's all wrong. So now we have yes and no. I think I know I mean a yes, but it's all wrong. That is, I think I disagree. Okay, so now we have, I think I know I mean a yes, but it's all wrong. That is, I think I disagree. So he thinks he means a yes, but it's all wrong. That is, I think I disagree. So you have this, and then on the other hand, you have this totally wishy-washy persona, but which is embedding this wisdom, of course, with Charles Manson got a lot of wisdom out of this. And then it continues, with increased dissonance. Then we have some Strawberry Fields Forever, creating this gentle space. And then the end of it gets even more psychedelic. You have this sort of mapping of interior psychedelic space with all these swirling sounds going around you. And there's some kind of weird little text reference at the end. And then if again, we can go into the actual musical materials of how this is working, but, and I'm not even necessarily making a case either way, but it seems like there's some pretty deep stuff going on in the song. And I think this song's bedfellow is I Am a Walrus, right? So could you just throw in just a little bit of that I Am a Walrus clip?
Sure.
From a gun. been a naughty boy, you let your face grow long. I am the Eggman. They are the Eggman. I am the walrus. Mr. City Policeman sitting pretty little policeman in a row.
Okay, let's go. So, if you look at the very end of that video, you get a still from it. You see the Eggmen. I am the Eggman. You are the Eggman, and they're all wearing these weird little egg caps, and they're just like this stretching centipede with these white. They look almost like lobotomy mental patients, right? So this song, you notice certain parallels with both "I Am a Puppet" or the Little Puppet, and with "Strawberry Fields Forever." We have this. You know, you have the beginning of the song, you expect to show the song's tonic, the musical tonic that is, and you go to like a different key center. So you got already this sort of musical dislocation. And then you have, you know, and you have a lot of odd musical elements in terms of, like the chord progression on the outro was described by musicologist Alan Polk as a harmonic Mobius strip with scales and bass lines and top voices move in contrary motion. So, and you have very, very detailed, complex harmonic structures related to the lyrics. So it's pretty complicated. But then you have these very strange lyrics, right? And then what do you think? I mean, that video with like the weird animal masks, I mean, it's definitely a little bit weird, right? And actually the Magical Mystery Tour was a book written about this guy's kind of occult tour of the world. He wrote, I think it was written in the 1920s by some, British occultist guy. It was called, Magical Mystery Tour was a book he wrote, but it's a reference to that too. But you have, Mr. City Policeman. You have this police, the authority figures. You have, the study of pigs. You have that little sort of which would become later a very powerful kind of Manson reference point. But then you have these spatial temporal dislocations, sitting in a garden, sitting on a cornflake. He's writing on a cornflake. He's sitting there, and then you have this like yellow matter custard, green slop pie, all mixed together with a dead dog's eye. Slap it on a buddy, 10 foot thick, then wash it all down with a cup of cold sick, waiting for the man to come. So there's some pretty bizarre imagery, but I am he and you are me and we are all together. So you have this dissolution of the social, you have this merging of the individual and the hive mind. At the same time, Lenin is clearly also stating, hey, I'm messing with you. Go for it, because I'm telling you what I'm doing. He said that he wrote it. He was on acid. Quote, the first line was written on an acid trip one weekend. The second line was written on the next acid trip the next weekend. And it was filled in after I met Yoko. I'd seen Allen Ginsberg and some other people who like Dylan and Jesus going on about Hare Krishna. It was Ginsberg in particular I was referring to. The words elementary penguin meant that it's naive just to go around chanting Hare Krishna or putting all your faith in one idol. In those days, I was writing obscurely, a la Dylan. It never dawned on me that Lewis Carroll was commenting on the capitalist system. I never went into that bit about what he really meant, like people are doing with the Beatles' work. Later, I went back and looked at it and realized what the walrus was the bad guy in the story, and the carpenter was a good guy. I thought, oh shit, I picked the wrong guy. I should have said I am the carpenter, but that wouldn't have been the same, would it? Singing, laughing, I am the carpenter. So,
yep.
So, anyways, and there's a use of a shepherd tone. There's all kinds of very interesting, musicological elements. Again, and then again, these sort of psychedelic parts. There's also a recording from King Lear that was put in there. So there's a recording from King Lear that shows that comes from when Edgar was talking to his estranged and blinded father, the Earl of Gloucester. Now, good sir, what? And then Lennon changed the channel and it says, poor man, made tame by fortune, good pity. So we have a reference to King Lear. There's several different versions of this. But anyways, we look at this, we can just use this sort of as a microcosm in that, okay, whatever you want to say, they certainly, especially if you're tripping hard, you're on LSD your whole life, these guys are your gods and your gurus, and they're imprinting this on your mind. And there's all kinds of very weird psychic language, again, that may be operating directly on the subconscious with very complex musical structures to emphasize that. We look at, going back to Bateson, creating a cybernetic loop that is a self-exciting system where binary values become opposing forces that eventually totally subsume the personality of the individual. Basically, it's like, as he described this in one example, talking about alcoholics, and alcoholics get this loop where they get a break off from the loop and they lose their connection with their normal external world and get locked in this mental cybernetic loop. And then you have two binary, these opposing forces. You can have peace and war. You can have authority and rebellion. And as this cycles, the idea, he looks upon it as basically this system starts to take on its own momentum and move faster and faster. The center of equilibrium is gone. You actually have this, you've basically set up this, dynamic system that will eventually destroy itself or create its opposites, right? And so you look at the rebellion. As you rebel more, the more you have to bow in authority to the countercultural gods in the system of whatever you've embraced. And so the walrus, you have this false creativity, pseudo synergy, not real synergy, not real creativity, but sort of this artificial, again, psychic world that's, again, created as a cybernetic loop within the mind, but also even within larger social structures. And then I am the walrus, and the Eggman, the hive mind, the dislocation, I am he, you are she, we're all together, identity distortion, the little puppet, I don't know, you can keep going. But that's basically saying that there's a lot of these psychological techniques that you can see to a certain extent being employed. And if you look at this as being something that's not just, randomly coming up with words when you're taking some acid and writing some stuff, you can see that this can have a powerful effect, especially when you're grown up listening to these other records, which I thought was pretty cool when I came across that, to think that kids in that generation were hearing some of these songs when they're very early childhood conditioning phase, and then you move into these later kind of musical examples of that. Again, with the authority figure that's directing you, et cetera. So we can leave it there, but yeah, that's basically, that's my spiel for the day.
All right, and we'll follow up with part 7, hopefully in the next week, on the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis, scientific research, get into, finally, hopefully, FM radio and John Lilly and all the good stuff that we've been saying for the last 6 episodes that we would get into.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, dude, when we started this, I thought we were going to do all this in one episode.
Yeah. Well, and then I thought we would get it done in 3, and then, so anyway, there's that. And so anyway, Hans, that's a wrap. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, brother. And yeah, please, check out my website. I'm going to get some stuff published here and move forward. And, definitely any support is always groovy, to use a wonderful word from my generation. Not that old, but yeah, it was
because you're feeling groovy.
But yeah, Jan, well, I will talk to you soon, and take care and keep up the good work.
All right, thank you, and you too. Talk to you soon.